Okay, so now you know whether or not your industry is attractive or unattractive, and the next step is to try to think about why. We're using the 5 forces approach to understand why historical profits are high or low, how and why a particular level of profit is achieved. Now, as Porter describes in that 2008 article and in as much of his writing, this framework can also be used to analyze what will affect the future profits of an industry. But my own approach is to think about that problem as separate from looking historically at how and why a particular level of profit is achieved. And the lecture that I'm giving you here is really focused on that first goal here of looking historically at how and why a particular level of profit is achieved. We'll look later at what will affect the future profit of an industry, but that requires that we have theories, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later in future lectures here. Let's focus now on the industry average that you've identified, and we're going to think about applying these 5 forces to understand what's happening here. Now, in this context, the way we're using the 5 forces framework, judgment and logic are essential here. The way that the 5 forces are laid out is designed to expose issues, to raise questions, and to get you to think about what could be driving the revenue and cost structure of an industry, rather than, apply some sort of scientific criteria that are collectively exhaustive and mutually exclusive, that are, regimented in their applicability here. Judgment and logic are required to tell the narrative or the story that led to the situation that you're looking at here. One of the things we've learned since the framework was initially developed is that there are some relationships between these different forces, and this diagram seeks to capture that. The work of Adam Brandenburger and his colleagues, particularly Gus Stewart and Barry Nailbuff, have explored and exposed some of these ideas in detail in their own writings here. What we know is that the amount of value that's created in an industry is primarily shaped by the power of buyers, the power of suppliers, and the threat of substitution. Think of buyers as driving the revenue structure of an industry. So for example, if we're looking, say, at the motorcycle industry, such as we do in the Ducati case, what you're looking at there for the revenue structure of the business are those payments that are being made to the motorcycle companies from the dealers. And the power of buyers is going to be shaped by the downstream structure of that dealer network, and then ultimately the consumers, relative to the motorcycle assembly companies in the first place, okay? The suppliers, on the other hand, account for the cost structure of the industry. So suppliers for the motorcycle companies would be the manufacturers of externally provided components, like the tires and the gas tanks and the chrome and so on, as well as anything that accounts for the cost structure of the industry. So it's going to include labor as well, the engineers, the unionized workers in the plants. The threat of substitution is alternatives to motorcycles. It's products and services that are outside this industry, outside the motorcycle industry, that may provide similar benefits to buyers or alternatives to suppliers, and I'll get into that in a moment here. The key here is to think of value creation, that is buyer power, supplier power, and the threat of substitution, as the size of the pie, the amount of profits that the industry is generating here. In other words, if you've got buyers that are extremely engaged by the industry's products and suppliers that are very willing to work with the industry, you've got this big gap between the revenue and the costs that are generated at the industry level. Substitutes are being held at bay here. That's a big amount of profit, of pie value there, that the incumbents in the industry are going to start to compete over. Similarly, that the threatening entrants are going to be thinking about when they decide whether or not to make that move toward entry. So the first question we want to look at is, what are the power of buyers, what's the power of suppliers, and what's the threat of substitution? How big is the pie here that's going to be carved up through processes of rivalry and the degree of, and the threat of entry here? So that's where we're going to begin our 5 forces analysis, is thinking about buyer power, supplier power, and the threat of substitution.